All right, I'm going to give a sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan.
And this is Mariam.
And we're sitting here with Andreas Arslan. And why don't we just start off with Andreas? Who are you and what do you do?
I'm a PhD student here at CU, and I'm working at... My research is focused on how causal structure is important or may be important for episodic memory formation. The basic thought behind this being that episodic memory is often studied like in terms of looking at stimuli that are very short and simple, whereas when you look at your own memories, they usually exhibit quite sophisticated structure, quite extensive complexity. And the idea here is a fairly intuitive idea, I would hope or assume, namely that if there are causal connections between various parts of experience, that this should reinforce these memories to some extent, and it should be an important component in the formation of complex episodic memories. And this was sort of my initial focus of interest, and then now that I've been researching this for a couple of years, I've also went on to looking at the episodic memory system in a more general sense, namely in that it is often purported to be not only relevant for the storage of memories, but also a more general system that may be capable of simulating hypothetical or future experiences. And here I'm mainly looking at what is the level of detail and the structure that these simulations that the episodic memory system can generate may exhibit. Yeah, what level of detail is actually there or may not be there.
Right on. So memory then is the sort of central focus of your work. And how do you treat memory as such? What do you think of as memory? You also mentioned episodic memory. Do you kind of lean on a distinction between episodic and working memory, or do you kind of just treat memory as a single monolith? You can also drink water first.
Oh, yes.
And yeah, we had chatted before how causality ends up being sort of a tangential facet, a concept that you sort of rely on to test memory, if that's correct. And then you're looking at the relationship between memory and imagination as well. And actually, 2 episodes ago, we had Maria Fedorova on, who is a philosopher of memory. Mm-hmm. So it's actually, of imagination. So maybe that'd actually be a fun conversation to have at some point, sort of empirical and philosophical work on imagination. But yeah, if you want to go ahead and talk about memory for a minute.
Yeah, as to your question about looking at what type of memory or memory in what sense, we are looking specifically at episodic memory in the classical sense that it's I guess in the most classical sense, it would be a memory representation that has the format of the experience during which the memory was formed. I wouldn't say that most memory research lives up to this actual definition, or research on episodic memory actually lives up to this definition or even tries to. But yeah, we are interested in specifically trying to encode longer stretches of time, though also now that I'm saying it, in practice, our experiments are the things that we show to people are more like positioned on the level of minutes. And of course, that's actually very short, but it's not, I wouldn't say that it falls into the domain of pure working memory, because then it would be beyond its capacity boundaries. But yeah, the hope is that this sort of time scale, although it may be very short, gives us some insight into how processes work at higher time scales, of course, because as I think I said before, memory sometimes, at least interconnected memory, sometimes can stretch years. Like an experience 5 years ago can fairly directly connect to something that happens now. If you meet a person again or something like that, to give a simplistic example. But yeah, that's the interest, or that's my assumption, my working hypothesis, that causal structure in some sense is a glue that can link experiences, memories of experiences across time. And that's, yeah.
Is it that your interest is in the strength of the encoding of memory? Is that kind of what the thing is that you're trying to test, and you're coming at it from different angles, from say causality to imagination?
That's actually something, we cannot directly look at, I think, right now, whether the effect of causality, and we have found effects of causality, so it's not merely hypothetical in that sense, whether it is on the encoding level or whether it is something more distributed, because there's also an argument to be made that if, I don't know what a good example of that would be, but let's say a fire starts somewhere and you see it, it also may have a causal effect in the sense that you already know that this is going to have consequences that you are then anticipating from the outset that you wouldn't in a less, dangerous or interesting situation. And then you look back and then you link it together. Or whether as soon as you sort of detect a causal connection, so let's say somebody operates a device and you see they're pushing a button and this does something, and then you have, there's a causal connection between the action and the outcome. And this has an immediate encoding benefit, as opposed to, this more linking of prospective and retrospective memory dynamic.
Do you think a causal structure can help you also fill in the gaps when, for instance, you don't remember the specifics of how the fire started, but you're able to piece together what could have started it? You know that there was, I don't know, a fire, a match somewhere, and that maybe the match was struck by accident. Do you know what I mean? Like, can you retrieve memories through retracing the potential causal steps of the event?
I would. This is something that we haven't explicitly studied, but just conceptually, I would definitely assume that this is the case. And this is also touches on an interesting aspect of memory, because causal structure may also, we haven't tested it again, something that could lead to false memory. Because if you think you know how something must occur and the linkages between cause and effect, then you may just rely on your knowledge and weave it into the memory, and this may distort the memory if you don't have enough sensory information to, or other lower level information to correct the course of your inference. So that is something I'm very interested in, and that's also to shift it on a potentially more positive aspect of that same dynamic. You could also, something that has interested me in terms of the relationship between causal structure and episodic memory is that if there's causal structure, especially causal structure in the sense of knowledge that you have, this should also enable you to abstract the memory. So it's not just a sequence of things happening, of people moving around or random sensory impressions, but rather an event that you can summarize, something like they had an argument, this person tripped. It sounds very simple, but sensorially a person tripping isn't necessarily extremely simple, but you can just say, it's the simplest thing to state. And that is something interesting about causal structure, I think, that it does enable you to compact the thing. And if you maybe have different layers of describing an event that you do not have if it's like a stream of arbitrary impressions, then you just either you recall what happened or you don't know anything about what happened. Yeah, then you can easily summarize it, but this summary may also lead to what you, I think, implied, or exactly. It can lead to false memory, I would assume, if one looks at it empirically.
I was going to say, first of all, that's very interesting. And second of all, it makes me think that, it makes me wonder whether this causal structure is relying on a more semantic system. So semantic memory, episodic memory. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this separation makes sense at all, or
the system separation in itself? I mean, first to the first part of the question, I would say, the things we have studied so far, we actually tried to filter out the knowledge that I was talking about, because we wanted to see if there's like a raw effect of causal structure. So we purposely devised videos where just weird things happened, but either they had like a physical causal connective, or they had like in just Newtonian causality, things bump into each other or there's some weird thing happening and it cannot be described as causal anymore. But where no higher level knowledge or semantic knowledge, or most semantic knowledge, would be useless in describing these kinds of scenarios. So we do not have data about the influence of semantic knowledge. But yeah, I think that this would be, in everyday situations, this would actually be the main kind of causal structure that could support memories. Because, yeah, we use our knowledge all the time. It would be weird to not apply the schemata that we have of everyday situations to summarize, to make sense of what we encounter in everyday life.
Yeah. Do you think about at all between the sort of bias variance trade-off when people are actually assuming causality? Like, is that one of the things that you manipulate? Because it's coming from, it's an interesting thing that you remove people's prior experience. And so you introduce them to a novel video where they have no prior. So they're seeing a novel set of interactions. And so that's the only information that they have about that thing. So they have no ability to judge the likelihood that those things happen because they're just seeing them for the first time. So there's no real influence of their prior beliefs or anything like that. So I think that's a really nice way to sort of test memory and causal structure. And so are there situations where you're moving more towards, like what you were just talking about, building tests where people do bring in prior knowledge and see if that influences their causality? Like, I can imagine something where you can ask them about their belief about two different causes or the relationship between two events and see if they actually have a prior belief about the causal relationship between those two things. Like, sunscreen protects you from cancer versus sunscreen causes cancer. These and then seeing if these priors actually influence how they might see an informational video or something. What do you think might happen there?
I think that as soon as you have information, as soon as you have these kinds of priors, as soon as you have this kind of background information, it may overwrite a lot of what you're actually seeing. Though that's, I think what you suggested actually would be, when, streamlined into an experiment, would be a very nice thing to do and thing to look at. The main reason we didn't do it was because there had been no evidence of the basic effect of causality initially. But yeah, my intuition would be that as soon as you have schemata to rely upon, it may erase what you actually have to pay attention to, and then it becomes difficult to disentangle. That's why we also didn't try to use things like movie clips, even though that would be useful, because there's so much expectation that it's difficult to know how much you actually rely on what you directly perceive. But yeah.
Can you, maybe it would be helpful to, you kind of alluded to some of the experiments that you've done, that you did the first set on causality. Can you tell us roughly what you found and if it's relevant, any of the setup that you didn't mention before?
As I said, it was very simplistic. It was kind of like in 3D stimuli that we created in free software. It's called Blender, where we just had weird shapes knocking into each other, and these were like multi-part videos, 3 or 5 or 7 parts long. And I just used models that I found online or created them myself. So it's really arbitrary stuff, like a giant spoon lifting up a rat sculpture. So that's what I mean by it's not completely alien. So it's not everything is blobs that you cannot identify, but the relationship between things, it's just completely senseless. But we presented multi-part videos to participants. And what we manipulated is what we call causal coherence. So we didn't have completely acausal videos where, let's say, something acausal, if that even makes sense at all, would be if I now transform into a candle. Then what happened there? I don't know. Both of the classes of videos, so both the fragmented and the coherent videos, had Newtonian causality in the sense that I mentioned before. The difference was that between the parts of the videos, either the things that happened in the first part of the video had a consequence on the subsequent parts of the video, or there was like a disruption. So if I knock something on the table to the side, in the second part of a fragmented video, that object may be somewhere else, and what happened, the information is lost, there's a disconnect. As opposed to the coherent videos, it's just like a video with cuts where continuity is maintained. And what we were interested in, do people remember the order of events better in coherent clips? And also we were interested in, do they remember certain causally relevant details better in coherent clips? And across a variety of experiments, it was very obvious that the order was indeed much better remembered in the coherent videos. So if you just show people like a frame of the video and then another frame, and they have to state that the second frame, is this from something that happened before or after this reference frame, the cueing frame, they are much better at placing it. So it's like in a movie, if you see an image of Frodo holding up the ring and then another frame of the video, did this happen before Frodo held up the ring or did it happen after? People are very good at this when they have coherent videos. They're not that good at it in fragmented clips. And then we also had a weirder kind of manipulation where we showed frames from the videos that were doctored, that were just manipulated, so they looked very similar to what we had shown to people, but they were not quite identical. So let's say a soccer ball hits a wooden pole or something like that. The lure images, as they were called, would flip the position of both. So the object identity is maintained, but something has shifted here. And as I think this is a boring example, but here it's important. If the ball knocks the pole, these are both causally important events. These are not background elements. And as we could show that for coherent video clips or for coherent stimuli, participants were more sensitive to such changes and could identify the things they had not actually seen better than in the fragmented clips.
Do you think that extracting a causal relationship simplifies what we have to remember? Is that what you think is going on? Like if I have to remember a sequence of a set of images, it might be more difficult to remember them as a random set of images. I have to store, say, 7 different units of information, as opposed to one unit of information that maybe has a second unit attached to it. Like instead of 7 different animals at different stages of life, if I have one animal aging, like over 7 different things, I just have to say, the lion aged, as opposed to young lion, old giraffe, middle-aged hippopotamus, whatever it is.
Yeah, I would think that's a very good way of putting it, that you have a relation instead of like a set of things that transpired that you just have to keep together. You just have to know what happened, or you have a starting point and an end point. And even if you don't know what happened in between, you have that linkage that ties them together. So I think that's where our hypothesis about better recall of order started. Because we thought if somebody knows the causal relation linking events together, that gives you directional information. And as you said, it simplifies, I would think, just what you have to keep in mind. And then you can sort of construct what happened in between if you have the endpoints. Maybe it's irrelevant if you completely make up what exactly happened, as long as you know the important pieces.
Right. Yeah, I like what you said, the construction of what happened in between, even if you witnessed it. Like if you two are throwing a ball to one another, I just need to remember Mariam throwing it and you catching it. I don't need to actually remember the process of the ball traveling. Because if you say, at which scene came first and you show 2 different positions of the ball, I can tell you exactly, which one came first. And so I think that's a really interesting thing. And is this how you're tying in the imagination component?
I think, yeah, this isn't explicitly how we arrived at this point, but this is a good example of it, where you could see a linkage, between, or you could see a natural point where the memory system could interface with this kind of imaginative system. I don't know if that's pronounced correctly, but where there could be an interface, because if you sort of fill in what is absent, then this indicates that there is a capacity of the memory system, or it could be a capacity of a different system, but it would make sense if it were a capacity of the system that stores the information to also sort of mend the parts that are unclear. Of course, the more general hypothesis is, not held by me, but by certain researchers, I'm simplifying it extremely, and I don't know the various ways this has been proposed. So there have been multiple claims about how the episodic memory system may be an imagination system or hypothetical scenario generation system. But yeah, that there is not even anything special about memories as such. That it is not even the core purpose of that system to store memories, but to just simulate, and then you either tag it as a memory or you tag it as something imagined, tag it as a future scenario. That's not a view I hold at all, though I think it's very compelling. But yeah, that's a good bridge between, and it also shows how a causal structure may be relevant, because these may be the important points along which the scenario is constructed in your head.
For you, are future planning and imagination synonymous?
I actually, I have not done any research where the distinction would be relevant. So the experiments we have done are just about imagined situations that have no relation to anything. So like if I told you, imagine a unicorn grazing on a meadow, will this happen? Could it happen? Who cares? It's just anywheres. I don't actually see a good argument for, unless it's tied to something really immediately happening, why there would be such a strict distinction between any of these things. So for me, this doesn't make sense, but I'm not sure if I have enough information actually to make a good argument about this. I know that some people see perspective thinking very differently from imagination. And if you really begin to think about how you would move around in a situation in the future, then I can see how this would require a kind of different information provided by the system than just thinking about something fairly abstractly. But to me, it's all in the sort of beyond of the future or the hypothetical space. That I look at it from a rather coarse level, I guess.
I just have one more question about this. So there's one aspect of your work, if I remember correctly, that has to do with what information people represent when they're asked to imagine something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how that happens with episodic memory. So if you ask someone to recall a scene from the past, would you say that they would recall the entire phenomenology of the scene? Or would there be also a selection of the elements of the memory that are relevant to the question, for instance? So, because the hallmark of episodic memory is supposedly you encode everything, is it?
I think what you implied, I would agree with, namely that it is not the case that it's like a replay of a movie when you recall a situation. But, for example, I think when somebody asks you, you remember when we did this, remember when we did that, remember when we were there, there is no clear, it's not a slider in a video that could even point you at where to begin. And it's also not the case. It's a very trivial thing to state, but if you think about how subjectively it feels like to remember something, if one is a dangerous territory to even put it like this, but do you think that you recall something you experienced on a time scale that is even comparable to the actual experience? So, let me just sit down and remember the holidays, and then I sit there for a few days, and suddenly the memory returns. So it seems like a much more abstract level of recall. Though it would be interesting, I'm not sure if that verges on the impossible, if you had both. So if you had the compressed time but full information, I just don't think that's the case most of the time. So, yeah, I would think you think about I recall we had an argument. That's where you that's the information you use to pinpoint the moment in time. Then you think about the important parts of the argument, and then you maybe think about, this was the most hurtful thing the person had said. Or even if it's in reverse, it's definitely not one level of just a very precise sensory replay, and then you extract what abstractly happened. I think the abstract parts and the sensory parts are interwoven, and the abstract parts predominate. That's my assumption.
Yeah, what's your take on it, Mariam?
I think you made an excellent point that I haven't heard that many times before, that when you're asked to remember something, you don't spend the same amount of time like you don't re-experience it in the same timeline. And I think that's a very, very important point that really shows how much we concatenate whatever we're remembering when we do remember. So what is the phenomenology then of episodic memory? Is it really a thing, would you say?
I mean, this is where we have to trust people, what they tell us, and where I would think, yeah, it's to be expected that there's a lot of variation, just as there's a lot of variation in all fields of cognition. But my assumption is that people tend to overestimate how vivid their memories are. But for memories, at least, I can at least see the point better that there is a sensory component that is very relevant to it in some parts. Maybe we give it too much importance, but I definitely think that I wouldn't discount that there are some parts of memory, if it's a very intense experience or something like that it can be something like a movie, that you can recall it in like in PTSD. I actually don't know much about it, so I shouldn't even bring it up, but I've heard at least that this is something that people report experiencing, and I can see how that would make sense. I'm more skeptical about the high level of detail that is being reported on the imaginative side of things, where I'm very, very skeptical about it. And that's what I'm currently sort of looking at.
So barring things like trauma encodings and things like that, do you see, maybe you see them as the same, but a difference between the fidelity of recall of an episodic memory versus the fidelity of an imagination? So if it's something like, even something simple as, do you remember what you had for breakfast today? Versus, can you imagine eating a horse this morning? Do you think that there's more fidelity in one than the other?
I'm not sure if I completely understood the question of the fidelity aspect of it.
Yeah, it might be that that's the wrong word to use, but how much you're able to flesh out the scene vividly in terms of what you see in your mind's eye. Is it like, if I'm thinking about what I ate earlier, do you think that without prompting, that somebody who's just imagining what they ate earlier, remembering what they ate earlier, do you think that has the same level of detail as something where somebody's imagining having eaten something they didn't eat? Or is it somewhat mixed for you in your mind, or the same?
That's actually tricky, because I think the breakfast example, you could make a point that this is something you just don't pay that much attention to. So I wouldn't know. But in general, I would say that even if you try to imagine something you are not going to do as vividly as you can, I don't think you can ever create something, or ever, no, that's too much of a superlative, but you're not usually going to create something that comes close to something you actually experienced. Because that is something, I think I alluded to it before, why I think the idea that the episodic memory system generating imagined scenarios and generating memories, generating in some sense, and then it's just the difference of tagging it as reality versus non-reality. Why I'm very skeptical about this idea, because I think the imaginative process doesn't create something that you are bound to confuse with something that actually happened. Unless it's something, if it's a very minor or everyday occurrence that you barely even paid attention to, then I would have to revise this argument. But if you sit down and imagine like a conversation with your boss, or you think about a conversation with your boss, then I don't think it's very likely that you're going to confuse the imagined scenario with the actually experienced scenario. And the reason for that being, or one of the reasons that I could come up with, or I would argue, is that if you imagine something, at least, and maybe I'm relying too much on my own intuitions here, you do not usually imagine it completely linearly. So you don't start with, I'm imagining a conversation with my boss, but I have to start somewhere. I'm walking in through the door. There he or she sits, and then I'm crossing the room, sitting down. No, usually you will, again, it relates to what we discussed earlier. you will think about the sort of nucleus if there's a conflict or whatever, and then you will maybe go to more specific parts, and you will go back and forth, and then you may revise what you are imagining as you are imagining. It's like a process of editing a movie or something, or writing a story, where not everything unfolds linearly. And of course, if you would argue, no, that's not how I do it, I imagine everything completely linearly, then I couldn't disagree with that. I just don't think that's the case. But because it's like a piecing together of this fictitious situation in your head, where your hand as the creator of this fictitious scenario is always a component of it, of the process of assembly, I don't think that the end product then resembles an actual experience where none of these things happened. It really happened linearly. Even if you don't recall it linearly, the information is stored in a way that you know that it unfolded linearly. Whereas if you are done imagining a scenario in your head, you usually don't say, oh, now I've put all the pieces together, now it's finished, now I savor this imagined situation that I can't come up with, and now it's packaged like a memory. So that's why I think, that's one reason why I think that this idea of confusing imagination and memory, or that it is structurally very similar, to me is not convincing.
That's an interesting point. I have a slightly different intuition on the memory component, but it's because I agree with you on the imagination component. It's a really good point that we don't necessarily imagine things linearly unless we're asked to. But I do think also that a lot of times in memory, we also don't reconstruct linearly. We might remember things as flashes, and we might even reorder the structure of a day. Which aspects of a conversation came first, which topics came up first, maybe where we went in a day first. So I can think of a random day in last December where I was going to different Christmas markets. Maybe I remember, we're in Vienna, so it's salient, but I might misremember the order in which I actually visited the Christmas markets, and I might even confuse having gone to a particular one that day. And I guess that's why I see the two as a bit more linked, because I don't have as much coherence maybe internally within the memories when I try to recall them. And to me, it mimics how I imagine. Maybe it's different for you. Because I know memory is a difficult thing because the variation in memory, individual memory, is also very different. But I guess for me, I keep a journal of every day. And so when I go back and reread the journals, I realize things are absent, or things happen at completely different times, maybe even of the year than I remember, if they're a few years ago. And then also I can misremember the order of events in a day. So if I try to imagine what the day was like and then actually read what happened in the day, it's almost like my imagination is something that I've constructed entirely that differs significantly from the actual event 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago. Is your experience different?
No, I wanted to say my experience is completely accordant with what you're describing. What I was trying to argue, and I see that it's not entirely convincing, but that the process of searching through the memory is not the entirety of the memory usually. Of course, if only bits and pieces remain, then this argument can still be made. But I was mainly talking about how the information is encoded and how I think this, even though then later much of the information is lost and the memory is eroded, it is still being encoded linearly, as opposed to the process of how you structure an imagined scenario. And again, you can search sort of through the same, or again, I didn't mention this before, I think you can search through the same memory in different ways and emphasize different components of your experience. Whereas imagination usually, unless one is obsessively thinking about the same imagined scene, it is like one search through a memory, and you only have certain pieces of abstraction and certain pieces of detail, and that's the thing. And usually I would also argue, maybe I'm conflating subjects too much now, but I would argue that most of the time when we imagine something, it has like a single purpose. So I imagine a scene and then I may never imagine it again, or I may remember I have imagined something, but it's not something I journey back to this thing that I imagined, and then I reimagine it. Whereas in contrast, I think that memories you can look at different levels, and you have the ability to look at different parts of it because you have this linear encoding, because you have more base information where reality impressed its structure on it. Then a lot of it gets whittled away through forgetting, but you still have many more layers and many more ways of looking at it. Of course, as I pointed out, and everyone knows, most of what we experience we completely forget, so it sounds overly dramatic, but 4 things that we tend to remember. I think this is an important point of distinction. I still see if you're not convinced by it, and I completely sympathize with how you described it, because sometimes what we remember is really just very abstract. But I think in general, there are sort of signatures of this. You have to go through the situation in real time. You don't know what's going to happen. You have to pay attention to your details. That gets funneled into your mind. You have to make sense of it as it goes on. That leaves a trace that will distinguish most experiences from most imagined scenes. Though there's certainly a gray area where there's overlaps, I would argue.
There's people that spend a lot of time every day imagining. They go back to the same imagined world every day. Have you heard of this?
Is this like a hyperthermesia or something like that?
I don't know what it's called, but it's that some people, ever since they were kids, they build this world like completely out of their imagination, and they revisit it, and they feel very comfortable in this imagined world, like detailed imagined world. I just wanted to mention that quickly.
That's actually fascinating.
Yeah, and maybe you could try to find these people and see the like difference of how fleshed out their memory is versus this world that they've created.
But just to ask, is this something like are people happy to do this, or is it something compulsive?
I think it's a bit compulsive.
Okay.
I think it comes from the fact that it's comfortable for them at first, but then it becomes, I'm not sure whether it's classified as a disorder, but I know that I heard about it in a clinical context. So it was described as something that, could sometimes impact the life of these people because they allocate so much time to it. But I just wanted to ask something about how you piece things together to maybe imagine things also. Do you think we rely on our experience of, say, the taste of some kind of meat that we have when we have to imagine tasting horse for the first time? Like, I was thinking that when you gave the breakfast example versus the horse example, am I relying also on my episodic memory to imagine the taste of this horse that I haven't eaten?
Or have eaten.
I sort of lack intuitions because I never imagine the taste of something at all. So maybe that's a blind spot. But it's just in general, I mean, like pieces of sensory things you have experienced as the building blocks of things you imagine. My intuition is no, but I think here I'm ready to say that this is just my intuition for myself, and I wouldn't draw any conclusions from it because I know that there are actually fairly popular theories that say that the imaginative process depends on you like chopping up your things you experienced and using these components like a mosaic to form imagined scenarios. So maybe I'm just not a sensory kind of imaginer or even experiencer, so I wouldn't know.
Do you think it's from scratch we can make up sensory experiences that we've, like from nothing? You think we can come up with things?
I just think that what people imagine is very abstract unless you explicitly do something like imagine a shed and then you imagine really literally a shed that you have seen. Though I would have to revise what I said because now I think I understood your point too, in a too narrow sense. I would think if you, and this harkens back to something we discussed once, when imagining like a scene, at what level of detail are you currently looking at your envisioned or imagined scene? if you sort of think about a shed, I don't know why I used that boring example, but now I'm stuck with it, and now you imagine the wood it's made of, then I can imagine that if you need a texture for that wood in your mind, then you will just use something from something you've experienced instead of painting with your imaginary pencil some marbling onto the planks of wood in your mind. So yeah, then I definitely would think that the previously experienced situations provide a kind of material which you use to furnish your imagined scenarios with. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It might be because so much of the brain is dedicated to vision. Maybe we just have a slightly better ability to imagine visual stimuli. I can imagine. The interesting thing is that the memories that seem to be the most accurate somehow is when I imagine a piece of music. Maybe because there's so much less information in music than in a visual field, and a lot of our brain is also dedicated to the auditory stimuli. But because it's so much simpler as information, I can recall music very vividly. That can also generate sort of an affective state inside. So rather than trying to recall it, I can actually simulate it. And then with visual stimuli, there's so much fidelity that, and we had been talking about this earlier, but this idea of how rich is everybody's inner experience of memory. And there's probably a degree of variation, but how I don't think anybody imagines as vividly as they see a movie. I don't even think that's possible, just because there's so much information that's required. I don't think you can just generate that information internally. That would be phenomenal if you could, and probably very disorienting. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's interesting because you said nobody could imagine anything that would resemble a movie in terms of detail. I would completely agree with you, unsurprisingly, given what I've said so far. But we cannot completely rule out that many people believe that they can do that. Even if it's rare, it doesn't appear to be all that rare. It is surprising, right, that people, if you just ask them superficially, that they can convince themselves. And now, of course, maybe we cannot know. It's a philosophical mystery what happens in reality. But let's say it's not possible, that people still may have the impression that, oh, what I imagine it's very vivid. It's basically a replica of reality. What does that tell us about the insights we have about our own imaginative process, which is almost paradoxical to me. And I know that some philosophers argued that what is the difference between seeing and imagining or envisioning? I don't know what terminology various philosophers used. I think Gilbert Ryle made that point in Wittgenstein, that if you see something, you can be mistaken, right? So I can look, now actually I don't have my glasses on, I look into the corner of the room, is that an electrical socket or is it something else? I don't know. I can walk up to it and then I see what actually is there. Whereas it seems very weird to give some analogous scenario or analogous example of that happening in imagination. Oh, there's something at the end of the hallway in my imagination, I have to get a closer look at it. So that doesn't seem to be happening. That feels like a very implausible kind of thing. But on the other hand, you feel like I guess I lost my train of thought.
So maybe I can. There's a thought that I had earlier about how both of your work has an interesting overlap for me when I think about it. When you think about the videos that you constructed, like a spoon and a model of a rat, and I think there was a chess piece, if I remember correctly. Yeah, okay. So you're using existing symbols rather than abstract shapes. And do you think that the existing symbols also contribute to the inferences people draw about causality? Like if you used random blobs and they had causal relations to one another, do you also think that would be more difficult? I mean, both of your takes on that, right? Because Mariam is working on, basically symbol construction, and I'm wondering if Mariam, you think that this impacts memory with Andreas' work, and Andreas, if you think that the existing symbols actually do make a difference.
You want to go first?
Okay. I would argue that it would make a difference, just very intuitively. If I saw a spoon doing something to a rat and the rat doing something to the chess piece, I think very spontaneously I would fetch the reference when I see those symbols. And I would have embedded in my memory the reference. So the spoon did this to the rat and the rat did this to the chess piece, not as completely abstract, not the way abstract blobs would be represented in my mind. So for me, I would think it would have an effect on the way that I would recall the scene. But what do you think?
No, I think I would totally disagree. Said that so smoothly. No, I meant the complete opposite. I would totally agree with that. In terms of, if it's recognizable and categorizable, it makes a difference. You sort of have to, just that an object is named, classifiable, and can be related to something you know, as opposed to amorphous blob A, amorphous blob B. Even if you control for, these are figures that are distinguishable to the same extent as sort of things we are familiar with are distinguishable, I would think, as soon as you have this kind of framework imposed upon it based on your knowledge, that this shapes how you process it and how you recall it. I think it is compelling, something I thought about I can't implement, just to create like an animated space that is very complex but completely impenetrable, because everything is unidentifiable and you don't know what's going on. So you're like blind to the world because you cannot make sense of anything. That's not a fully fledged concept for an experiment, but this kind of thing I think would be interesting to do.
What do you think is happening when, just posing random questions, but if the spoon and the rat and the chess piece are help with the memory, imagine I had 10 different objects, right? All identifiable, and there was an 11th object that is a blob. My intuition, and I agree with both of you on this, about the saliency of symbols, existing symbols. My intuition is that I don't know if everybody would remember all 10 of the existing symbols, but they would definitely remember the blob if it's an outlier. So how do you also make sense of that?
Again, I would agree with that. I would relate it to something that I thought about when constructing these experiments, because we had to think about acausal versus causal, acausal, absence of causality versus presence of causality. What we didn't do, for example, is create scenes where you have like miniature miracles happening. Like if these glasses started to levitate, then that would be extremely memorable. So I also think that the blob would be extremely memorable, because there's now one blob and a bunch of other things you can identify. If there's a world that behaves coherently and then there's one incoherent event, then that jumps out at you. If everything's incoherent, everything becomes incomprehensible. If everything is a blob, you have to be like a blobologist. You have to know how they function to make sense of their structures, etc.
This morning I ran into Lotta Pesonen in the tram, who's a new student here at CU, and she works on memory, and she works on the effect of predictability on memory, and how unpredictable events are represented in memory, and whether they are sorted through the same systems, basically, predictable and unpredictable. And she told me that apparently unpredictable memories are better recalled short term, but then they're less robust over time. So you'll remember the blob popping out maybe more accurately than you would remember, I don't know, object number 4 that is identifiable. But then you remember more long-term the predictable ones, because these are the more useful ones. So in this specific example, I'm not sure it works, because what is predictable if all 10 objects are different? But speaking generally about the way that we go about the world and what we memorize, that's the point that she made, and I thought it was interesting. Go, Lotta.
That's a really good point. Because the way I see, because I deal with uncertainty a lot, like the concept of uncertainty, I see uncertainty as, for it to be useful, it has to be bounded. So total uncertainty, something that borders chaos or chaos itself, is you're unable to extract any information out of chaos. I think that's definitionally how I personally define chaos, is something which has no perceivable information. And chaos to me could not be chaos to you because you have the necessary bits of information to be able to extract new information from it. And I think that this relationship is really important. So I can remember, my take is that I can remember this blob because it's there's one element of uncertainty, but if they're all blobs, it's just too much uncertainty. There's no information to gain. But if you're a blobologist, then I have the necessary information so that if there's a novel type of blob at blob 11, then again, I can sort of extract information from that. So I think that there's, in general, with this predictability thing you just mentioned, Mariam, as well, I think that in general, there's this like a distribution that you could draw that's roughly Gaussian, right? Where at either end of the spectrum, if it's too bland, then you probably don't remember much. And if there's too much chaos, you also don't remember much. But there's some kind of sweet spot where you can optimally learn.
Yeah, I would also agree with the importance of predictability you mentioned, because I think that the mind must have some way of dealing with too much successive unpredictability. So that's also something that I was thinking about when, wondering about how causal structure may influence the shaping of episodic memories. If you have one surprising thing, then, as we discussed, that would draw attention to itself and may be seen as important. But it's a bit like if you think about a movie with a plot twist. If you have a movie with 15 plot twists, I think after the second or third, you may, it's just, the pieces won't fit together. I'm stopping. I won't pay attention to it anymore. So your mind has to have some prospective way of gauging whether will this be important. And if there's too much unpredictability, you may just draw the line here and say, oh, now this does not fit together so far. It probably won't. Now this is disconnected from what will happen. I'm, reducing its weight in memory or something like that.
Yeah, I think this is a crucial aspect to how we learn and also how we teach anybody anything, is that when there's too much uncertainty in the information that we're viewing, there is at best a disinterest, because I think that's psychologically the healthiest. But it can transition to frustration, right? If we need to engage with the thing, we can't. To maybe the exasperation where you're frustrated, but you also give up, to potentially even fear about the thing, right? And I think that this is, a lot of people go through these, what I'm going to coin on the spot as I think about it randomly, these 4 stages of trauma with like maths and stuff, like these are the 4 stages of learning traumas. But yeah, there's it's interesting that we then recall maybe not the aspects of the uncertainty, but we remember the affective component of it. We remember my dis-ease with this topic, but I don't remember. Maybe I can remember a teacher that was particularly vile, but I don't remember the actual process of feeling uncertain. I just now associate that teacher and that topic with disinterest or uncertainty, discomfort. So how do you think at all ever about affect and memory?
I think it's been amply proven that very emotional experiences are remembered better. I haven't looked at it, in my own research. I think it's very interesting, but I would also assume that it's pretty difficult to disentangle affect from structure, because what is going to be a highly emotionally salient event? It's usually there has to be also a very structured situation. Even if it's somebody screaming at you in the street, there's an obvious initiator. Somebody came up to me and screamed at me. It was unpleasant. But I actually think, again, I haven't thought about this in detail, but now that you bring it up, one aspect that this whole way of talking about it, the way I've talked about it, sort of leaves out, I've been talking about causal structure in the world that we infer as we experience something, and then maybe we can see the relations or we can't see them, and this affects how well we remember it. There's also something like the causal impact on us. So does something evoke a strong response in me as opposed to it doesn't? So a highly memorable conversation where I remember what one remark made me think and what kind of thought it triggered in response, as opposed to like a bland conversation where I don't remember what happened at all. Doesn't have to be a conversation, of course. It can be something like you described the situation with the teacher. The teacher quizzed me. I don't even know what he was talking about, but I remember that it made me upset because it was unfair or it was incomprehensible, etc. So I think this is something extremely important that I have to admit that I haven't looked at all. That this web of cause runs through you. It's not just in the world outside. You are a part of it. It may overshadow much of the time what you actually observe, and what doesn't affect you isn't actually sort of automatically less interesting than the things that have the capacity to evoke a response in you. But
definitely. And related to both your points, maybe we remember vividly emotional experiences because we need to remember the causal structure also. How am I going to avoid feeling horrified when, I don't know, I'm going through the forest and I have this memory of running into a grizzly bear? How can I avoid that, going through this experience again? Well, now I know that if I take this path, I run the risk of going through this again. But if I take another path, maybe I won't.
Yeah, I have this, my understanding of it is strongly sort of evolutionary, even though I try not to make too many assumptions based on by building evolutionary hypotheses. But I think this tracks with both positive and negative affect, in that I'm going to stick with people who provide me the type of validation which mitigates my uncertainty sufficiently that I feel happiness or joy or comfort. And then I'm going to remember those things. And then I'm also going to remember the things that make me feel fear and uncertain, and also potentially even the people that make me feel that way. And everything in the middle is sort of, do I need to remember that? I think it's strongly based on what the outcome is, the reward, and the reward can be something external, or it can be something intrinsic to my system. It can be a physiological or phenomenal reward. Like if I wake up and go trek to see a sunrise, there's an affective salience there, but there's also sort of a visual phenomenal reward that I receive from it that might generate a certain set of thoughts. Maybe one thing we can also go into is the set of experiments that you're doing now, because you kind of alluded to them and also how they're based on imagination, but I really like what you're doing there, so it'd be fun if you can just give us a small explanation of it.
Okay, yeah. Maybe I could also just briefly mention the experiments that this is sort of has been inspired by. It's very simple because the thing that gave me the excuse to go from a causal structure and episodic memory to really think about simulation and imagination was a fairly recent paper that I found. I think my supervisor Jonathan showed it to me it was called non-commitment in imagination, I think, if I got the title right. So non-commitment may already evoke some of what we have discussed earlier, and what they did was really very simple, and I found it compelling that it was so simple. They just showed sentences to people and asked them to imagine the content of the sentence as vividly as possible, or as vividly as they could. And the only sentence that I remember from the paper is annoyingly weird, but it's like a person walks into a room and knocks a ball off a table, which, doesn't give you that much information about what actually transpires there. And what they did after having instructed the people to imagine this very rudimentary scene, one could say, is just give a list of features and ask people if they had specifically imagined them. So did you imagine the color of the person's hair? Did you imagine their gender or how tall they were, or the shape of the ball, the trajectory of the ball? And here actually, sort of a bit in opposition to what I said before, that people overestimate the vividness of their imagination. They actually were seemingly honest, because even though none of the features were very obscure, it was not like, was the person wearing this kind of shoe? It was fairly general features. I think only about 60% of these features people reported imagining. So of course it's more than half, but still it's not close to photographical if something like the gender or the hair color of the person is missing. So what kind of image is that? And based on this kind of study, we did a few similar experiments, also using vignettes. And we wanted to not just have people imagine scenes, but to also try to bring into something functional. So here there's really no point in imagine the person knocking a ball off the table. It's just do this. We were interested in, if we ask people to imagine this kind of scenario, this kind of vignette, does the way they imagine the scene have a consequence on how well they can answer a question about it? And then we used from another paper what they called stumpers, which are like weird scenarios or almost riddle-like scenarios that are usually phrased as questions. And the point of stumper, the stumped is a very common term, but stumper I think is not that common to say it like that. At the end, you're left wondering, you can't quite make sense of this situation. And we used a vignette from a different paper about, I think I've described it many times, but just to briefly describe it, it's like a person in a truck drives down a country road. The moon is not out, the headlights of the truck are not on, and there's a cow right in the middle of the road. But the person has no trouble, steering the car around the cow and avoiding it. How is that possible? So that was the original scenario. I don't know if I conveyed it clearly enough, but here the trick is just it's in broad daylight, and it just sounds like if the moon isn't out, why would you say that if it isn't night? And that confuses people. We used that scenario, but we didn't put a "can you solve this" at the end. We just told people, "Can you imagine this?" And then we looked at what features did they imagine: the width of the road, the mood of the cow, whatever, the shape of the truck. And then we asked them, how does this make sense? How is this possible? After having asked them about the features, and we found that how vividly you report imagining the scene has no bearing on whether you are able to solve this stumper. And then we of course asked people if they were already familiar with that to rule that out. So you can solve this abstractly, which may not be all that surprising in this scenario. But then we looked at different scenarios. This didn't work out so well. And now the final stage, which is more interesting to me actually, we created vignettes about spaces where they're really boring, I have to confess. It's just like a person sitting in a living room, and then the person gets up, walks to the bookshelf, walks to the window, walks back to the couch, and just in that description, there's something that doesn't make sense. So it's a very explicit text where really the person goes to the left, the person goes to the right, the person makes a 180-degree turn, and then the person's back at the couch. But this is just described in a way that doesn't make sense. So they wouldn't in actuality be at the door or something like that. And we now are just piloting this and wondering whether people can even pinpoint that there's anything wrong with this. And then this specific vignette, it turns out of 15 people we tested, I think only 6 saw that there was a mistake in that. And in a more nuanced kind of vignette I made, I don't want to go into too much detail about these various vignettes, but there was like the idea that the shadow cast by a parrot, that was a bit too weird, that's the story, it was in the wrong direction. So the sun was there, the parrot was there, but its shadow was there, so it didn't make sense. And there, I think only 1 out of 15 people imagined this. And these are stories, there's no meat to these vignettes. Really, the spatial descriptions are almost all that's there. And yet, it isn't something it's very noticeable, apparently, which definitely runs counter the idea that people simulate this in their heads, even though we expressly, maybe I didn't emphasize this enough, expressly ask them to imagine this as vividly as you can. Of course, you could say, who's going to do that? I won't bother even if somebody tells me to. But yeah, so this is the current stuff.
What is their task? Like whether they're told to explicitly imagine the scene and then you move on to the questions immediately?
So these last few things I described are really just pilots, but at the moment we just tell them imagine this, And then I think I had one decoy thing, like, did you imagine the color of the cat? So that doesn't immediately go to the spatial question. But after that, we have successively concrete questions. So after this first decoy thing, it's just, did you notice something odd about the text? Or did you notice something strange about the vignette? Yes or no? And if you pick yes, you have to state what it is. Then there was an objective error in the text. Now that you know that there is something, an objective flaw in it, can you recall what it was? Yes or no? And then this didn't. Then in the third question, we explicitly say what didn't make sense. Can you now, in hindsight, figure out, or can you confirm? Oh yeah, now I recall this didn't make sense. But now the pattern at this point seems to be that people either initially get it or they just don't. So they will initially say something was strange. Oh yeah, the couch was in the wrong spot, or they won't ever. Maybe they pick the last question. In hindsight I can see it, but I don't know. Can they? Maybe they just selected. It's an online test. So,
do you think there are cases in which the imagination of a scene can get in the way of spotting errors? Like, I'm thinking of the example of driving the truck with the cow on the road in broad daylight. If I am imagining step by step, the moon might trigger an imagination of nighttime, and that might get in the way of me actually solving the riddle. Whereas if I take everything abstractly as concepts, I might not miss the fact that it ought to be day if they can see and the moon's not out. Does that play in for you?
That's a great point, and that actually there's some contradiction in the findings in that regard, because that seems to be the problem. That people they don't answer, did you imagine the time of day? No, I just didn't imagine it. Everybody imagines the time of day, but they all get it wrong. So they did imagine it, but what does not seem to be the case is that they have an integrated scene of it. So this is this imprecision in the term imagining here, I think. So what you are saying, I find very convincing. They imagine the moon, and then it's just there. Then the night sky remains, even though you remove the moon. But they don't imagine this whole, road. But it's certainly the case, it seems like, in this kind of scenario, it's a too much of an assumption put in that sort of hampers your ability to find the correct answer. Because once it's in your mind, you are not aware that that this is your assumption, and everything you generate in your head trying to come up with an answer is influenced by this assumption, and you cannot change the variable consciously. So I would agree that this seems to be what holds people back here, yeah.
Yeah, when I write a poem, the order of the images is really important. So if I said, the moon is out versus it's a clear night, there is no moon. Like I want to trigger the image of the moon first before I trigger the image of anything else. And I think that there's something about how we even tell stories and the narration when it's sort of crafted in a particular way. This is something that storytellers and poets, prose writers, I think use to their advantage, this sort of like implicit assumption that the order of the words will call up a series of images, and that the order in which the images appear might have an impact on the overall sensation that is generated by the reader internally. Do you also have any intuitions about that when you're narrating the scene, when you're describing the scene? Is there an order of events that you're considering that might generate conflict with or get in the way of how people imagine the rest of the scene or how the scene comes together?
We haven't explicitly considered it yet, but or we haven't implemented it yet. But from what I have to agree with what you're saying, there has to be some kind of, just out of necessity, some hierarchy of information that's being conveyed, and that is also, to answer more broadly, the general mystery, because the people who wrote this non-commitment paper I brought up before, to coarsely sort of paraphrase their opinion, they think that the imaginative process is something like a scene construction, where in the beginning you have a rough sketch that you refine or you don't. So I guess the first steps of the hierarchy would be the configuration, but you don't. If you imagine people around a table, but you can still leave the silhouettes and the table shape is indeterminate and things like that. But you have this kind of layout conveyed, and then you paint in the details. So this is a very they liken it to a games engine in a computer game. And what you are saying is like the first bit of information has special priority. It frames everything that comes afterwards, which I would think is a more natural way of thinking about it. So I wouldn't commit to the idea that we draw in our minds a scene from the ground up, we have the spatial relations, and then we refine the details. But more of like a succession of images. They do influence each other, but they may not be localizable in this connected space. But definitely, certainly if something is mentioned in the penultimate sentence, it cannot frame how you imagine the scene to the same extent as something that's happened right at the beginning. So whether unconsciously or consciously, I'm sure that most good authors will employ this, or artists of any sort, to create or evoke some sort of impression in their readers or whatever.
When we look at Icy's work, for example, one of our other co-hosts, Rui Yao, so she's working on the effect of verbal priming, of linguistic priming, on your recall of a causal event, of the order of a particular event, actually how far along the event is, so like the burning of a log. And so this is the implications of language on imagination, particularly the combination of watching a burning log, so there's a memory of the actual watching of the scene, and then the linguistic description, the log is burning versus the log burned, and then the recall, which in some sense to me then requires a bit of imagination, because the linguistic framing of the scene impacts people's recall of the scene. So they're imagining having seen things that they didn't see. And so here the language is supervening between the memory of the event and then sort of generating a new imagination of the event and impacting it. How do you make sense of that as well? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
I think for me it's difficult to think of. I think the phenomenon is super interesting, that people wind the clock forward and then come up with something they haven't actually seen. But at this coarse-grained level, I can't really, I just don't know enough about this specific subject to even speculate about the mechanism. Because to me, language, I'm not sure how much language does on this level of very specific impressions, because language seems too imprecise to convey such a nuance, but obviously there are these findings. So I'm excited to hear about how this works, but I have no original ideas about that, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting because you moved from visual stimuli to verbal stimuli, linguistic stimuli, and so there is a shift then in how you are presenting the stimuli to participants. So I suppose, and this is also totally normal, but are you taking for granted that they're generating a similar type of thing, or was there a shift to language for a particular reason?
You mean in
your experiment specifically? Yeah.
Oh no, we just we don't have another way of conveying a scene, so it's very, very boring. Though I agree that when one uses language, one has to sort of think about certain nuances. Maybe I'm not considering them enough, perhaps at this point. But yeah, I would be interested in ideas about how to do such a thing without language, but I just couldn't come up with anything so far, because I know that as soon as you emphasize or as soon as you make ample use of language in your stimuli, you sort of will get the question, so is this a language-based phenomenon? To me, it isn't. I don't think about it that way. To me, it's just like language is the information that's supplied. It has to come in. It has to be specified in some way. And the beautiful thing about it is that language is precise and ambiguous at the same point. It's not like a cartoon where you have like spatial information that's baked into it. You can have spatial information, but also a lot of ambiguity in a language-based description. And I just, I wouldn't know how else to create this kind of ambiguous scene that also has a lot of information.
I see a link between IC's experiment and the chunking, the abstract chunking that we're able to do when we're remembering things causally, like you said before. So I think you said that when we recall the causal chain, basically we're able to represent more abstractly what was going on, and we don't have to go into very fine-grained levels of detail when we're recalling something. And I wonder if for IC's experiment, in both cases, we have an abstract representation of the log burning. So you have first the visual input, and this is transformed into a semantic representation of the log burning. And this abstract representation finds a match with the written sentence, the log is burning, and both are abstract representations, but the second one pulls the other one maybe a bit more into this direction, whereas the log burns. Anyway, so there could be an interaction between two abstract formats of representation of this burning log. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And also, do you think, I mean, maybe this is a question more for IC, but like, if, for instance, you have a burning log, and then after that you have a person that's running, versus burning log and person that obviously was running but is stopping and like panting and resting. Do you think there's enough, like how abstract has this causal, is this representation of causality here? Because you could, like if it's super abstract, like going versus stopping, we could maybe find the same types of effects.
So you mean if the person is running and doesn't stop, that this will lead one to assume that the log has burned longer?
Yes.
I don't know. I think it's very interesting. It would be very cool if such a finding could be obtained. I'm not sure, but in these kinds of things, whether it would be useful to have such a... So it would be... That would be more like a bug than a feature to me if that were the case, because why? Right?
Because
it would really be just the abstract information contaminating what you've seen without any gain on the side of the thinker. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm misunderstood.
You mean the phenomenon in and of itself, regardless of the modality?
No, in this specific case, if there was a retroactive effect of seeing the person running, influencing what you recall of the log, that would just seem like a bleed over of this information.
So I think it would be interesting because it would show that it goes beyond language in terms of how abstractly we represent the ongoing action. It doesn't matter in which modality you abstract ongoing versus not ongoing. It still has the same type of effect on your representation of the previous event.
Also, it all gets converted into this kind of global currency as opposed to remaining in there are a lot of people who think that this is the case, like the language of thoughts, ideas go in that direction. I don't know these more recent Hafri kind of papers. I think this is strongly linked to that, but I'm just not knowledgeable about that. I don't know much about the language of thought, but I'm a bit skeptical about this in general. But yeah.
So you're also a reader. That came up as well, like of novels, of fiction. Do you think about your research occasionally when you are also reading? Like, does that come up for you when you're going through a novel? The way that you imagine and the way that you recall some of the events in the book. Do you ever try to think about those as somebody who's working on imagination and recall?
Definitely, yeah. Especially now, I've actually, after my supervisor brought this up explicitly, I was very curious to look for errors in books that may be completely irrelevant. But so far, I unfortunately haven't found good examples of that. But I have to think that this must happen all the time. That there's just descriptions of like offices or buildings that make no sense at all, or not no sense at all, that have glaring errors as soon as you are aware of it, but nobody cares. Nobody actually simulates this in sufficient detail to find them. But also, yeah, on the more artistic side of things, I also think about how these descriptions do not get translated by the brain into this kind of image that you are looking at while reading that. So this is not how I imagine the process of imagination now, because I think it's more of an impressionist palette. Though, yeah, it's weird. I think it's a succession of details and abstractions that never get woven together completely coherently, and yet, because I don't want to go on about what we can't do and how we are limited in our capacity to imagine things, it seems to be enough to not do this. So the information seems to be there. It seems to be an extremely powerful system, even though we do not have a matrix in our heads, and we're like, you have these avatars in our mind that we move around like we would see things on the outside. There's enough information to manipulate the world precisely and to think about it precisely. And there's enough information in a book that is, in a text that is extremely underdetermined to convey something very meaningful and interesting. And it would be exhausting and even idiotic to go into insane details and waste space on it, because that's just not the point. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there's an interesting, I suppose, because when I think about the events in a book, I remember them presumably somewhat similar to how I experienced calling them up when I was reading. But of course, there's something of a series, the sort of series of images rather than the fleshed out constructed scene, where some images that I construct on the fly as I'm reading, I'm not even trying to necessarily imagine, it's just what's happening as I read, that end up sticking out of my mind for one reason or another. And I guess this is, when I think about it, it's obviously so hard to remember to describe verbally how we imagine or recall, but it's almost like there's typically something devoid of color. It's maybe abstract shapes, and like if I think about, say, the face of my grandmother or something, I can have a face that I recall of my grandmother, which I can use as a placeholder. It's not her exact face. But if I then recall the face of my grandfather, I can hold those two images simultaneously, and I can remember, it's almost like a symbol of each one's face. And I can remember that they're the face of each one. And I won't confuse them because I've attributed meaning to them abstractly. But it's not the perfect face, of course, and it won't be. And I think that there's something interesting about that. I don't know what to do with that thought, but it's what I think about when I think about the diversity of how we describe what we imagine. Because somebody might have, say, the same phenomenal experience that I do, but they would describe that as, oh, of course I can describe or imagine my grandmother's face, because they can use it as a symbol placeholder.
Right, yeah. No, I would completely agree with your characterization. It seems to be, if the information is there, then the variability oftentimes is just in our judgments about the information. And you could, for example, as some philosophers have, I think, brought up, the idea that imagining a face is like preparing your mind how it would react, like simulating how you would react to seeing the face. It's not actually like conjuring up the face in your head. And if you do that successfully to whatever extent, some people may say, I'm seeing the face, and some people may say, it's a very shadowy, murky image, but I have some information about the face, yeah. The thing that I'm more skeptical about is if we, as soon as we go to likening this imagination to a really physical space with properties of distance and various sizes and luminance and things like that, then I think it falls apart, even in people who have a very vivid imagination. I just don't think that there's that you can, like, a perspective drawing, that you can reconstruct this kind of thing in your head and move around the virtual camera and zoom in on objects, move back, and everything remains fixed.
Yeah, and maybe this is interesting, maybe it isn't. But because I take the mind to be fundamentally the brain to be a predictive machine. I'm way more on the sort of predictive processing account of understanding the mind and brain in general. One account of imagination and mental imagery that is reconciled to the predictive process account is that we have the ability to imagine, to call up mental imagery purely because it's sort of an anticipation of stimuli to come. So if I say apple, the reason why some type of mental image of apple appears to you is because the trigger of the word, the word itself acts as a trigger to then simulate the anticipation of the sight of an apple, and that all of language generating imagery is the brain simply doing a prediction about stimuli to come. And I find this particularly compelling purely because I do reconcile the mind and phenomenal experience as a function of the predictive brain. But I was wondering if you also either of you have any thoughts on that as well.
So I don't know much about this. I think it's very interesting. I wonder how it would work for something that's completely impossible, either physically or it's a creature that doesn't exist. Do you think it would still be predictive, kind of? Like imagine a huge alien with blue, green scales and whatnot. What we conjure into our minds, is that still predictive, even though we know that it doesn't exist?
Yeah, I think it's what we've seen or imagined before.
Yeah.
Because when you said a giant alien, I already thought of something. Mm-hmm. And then when you said green scales, then I imagined green scales.
Yeah.
And I think that the brain is anticipating the stimuli. There's no, we attribute awareness to ourselves, but there's no awareness of the physical organ of your brain to be like, aliens don't exist.
Yeah, it's
right. Like alien, it's just like boom, association and the stimuli, the imagination.
I think this kind of predictive coding or just a predictive brain paradigm in general is very compelling, but I cannot really see how it fits more abstract thoughts that well, which is if the argument is like that imagination is often abstract, then I'm not sure how much it prepares us, because there is no, either we believe that there is actually a strong sensory component to the imagined scenario, then it would be preparatory in a sense. But if it isn't, what does it prepare us for? So I'm not sure about this kind of layer of the idea. Maybe I misunderstood that.
No, I think that's probably the most important question, is if this is happening, if this is what's happening, if brains are fundamentally predictive machines, if they're anticipating stimuli, if cognition is essentially the product of anticipation in a very crude sense, without wasting too much words on it, then other biological life would also be having mental imagery, which I think is probably the case to some extent. But the thing that humans would be able to do, which is different, is anticipate the abstract, something that we would consider thought. So the dog, and I think this probably this explains something like the Pavlov's sort of reaction, right? Is that there's an association of stimuli, therefore the dog's whole system, the body, inclusive of the body, anticipates the food as a response to the bell, and so you get this salivation response, right? The conditioning, and I think that that this is one good way to make sense of conditioning, and that we are sort of conditioned in the sense in that we're anticipating stimuli based on associations. But the crucial thing, which is still the open question of how humans manage to do that or evolve the capacity to do, is that we are able to anticipate concepts which are not necessarily directly tied to tactile stimuli. So I don't ever need to have seen justice to be able to imagine justice or anticipate a bunch of thoughts and feelings around the word justice. Whereas with an apple, that is the case. So it's sort of an easy one to reach for. I like apples. They taste good. They're red. There's a taste involved, even if I can't imagine flesh out the taste immediately. I've experienced the apple, but I haven't experienced justice. Maybe I've experienced concepts related to justice, and maybe I have fleshed out feelings about it. But I think that important conceptual leap and anticipation that humans can make, whatever feelings you have when I say justice, then I think that the feelings that you have that are generated by me using the term is also evidence towards this anticipation.
For me, at least, the predictive mechanisms make a lot of sense for low-level sensation or intermediate-level sensory processes and motor processes, but I'm never sure about these abstract levels, because let's say I have the prediction that I'm going to a meeting and it's going to be awkward, and there's a set of trillions of situations that can be awkward in various ways. How does it prepare me? Because I then, in the reality, will have to be able to react efficiently to the thing that actually happens concretely. So I don't know, because it seems like an inverse problem if you have the abstract prediction to create from that a specific scenario. And that's where I'm not sure about the how that's aligns with the more obvious thing to me. Like, I have a prediction that if I lift this cap, that it has a certain weight because I've done that before, and then it actually informs my behavior. So I am not sure how the abstract information can be converted into something more concrete.
Yeah, I think that is the primary open question. I think in a case like I'm going into a job interview, the anticipation is not that I can fully construct of course, anything we anticipate has margins of error. But I think with something like a social interaction, if I'm going into a job interview, the fact that my heart might be racing, I think is a preparation for something like a response of running away. And not that we would, but of course, we don't need to. I don't think we need to fit, especially the complexity of the lives that we live, especially the social lives that we live, into the understanding of how physiology works. Because I think we'd always fall flat because there's so much complexity in human life, and as complex as the mechanisms are that biological life has given us, I don't think anything could prepare us for the society now. How does evolution prepare you for an interview for a job in an office? But I think that what we do is rely on the anticipations that we can build that might be useful. Like, I might anticipate questions that I might receive. I might anticipate how I might feel. So I would have a breakfast and a coffee before. And even still, I might have a physiological anticipation of the result of the interaction, where my heart rate goes up and I get thirsty and my palms are sweaty. I guess that's how people would see it initially. And I think there's rightfully so a lot of work to do in terms of understanding more of that. But I think that would be a loose sort of naive rebuttal of what you said, which is, again, obviously the points you're raising are really important.
No, to me it's more like I completely see the whole functionality of prediction. I'm just not sure about how the mechanisms of higher cognition that we sort of are so proud of in us can be tied together easily with these like more the sympathetic nervous system prepares us for a stressful situation, things like that. But I'm also, actually predictive coding is not the topic here. I'm also always skeptical about prediction when this is brought up on certain levels, on like the meso level or whatever you want to call it, because I can't predict anything. I find I can't predict, like opening a door. There's a lot of sensory predictions, or just turning around a corner of an environment that I'm familiar with. Then my mind certainly is prepared in the sense that if suddenly the wall of a house I go into every day would be different, then I would recognize that and would be, oh, that's weird. But on the other hand, I have no idea how either of you is going to react really specifically. I know I would be shocked if somebody screamed at me or attacked me. That would be surprising. But there's an extreme spectrum of reactions, of nuances that I have no idea about. And that's why I'm always confused about the predictive paradigm. What sort of precision is implied here? At what level? But of course, I mean, I guess that's unfair. Because I think the paradigm is very interesting. I think it's an unfair criticism, but I think it also should be brought up because there's so much that doesn't seem to be predicted.
Of course, yeah. It's more that the prediction of the endpoint would be, there's no teleology there. I don't need to perfectly predict the outcome. It's more like the brain is trying to predict the extent to which it can predict, and then everything it can't, it doesn't. It predicts what it can. And I guess that's the thing. And I get, to me, that's sufficient in that there's always a margin of error in everything we do. And with things that we've experienced, with things that we have more evidence towards, we're going to have a more solid prediction, and even take for granted. Like every time we take a step on the ground, we assume that the ground's going to hold us up without a conscious assumption. And the more time we spend together, the more fleshed out of an expectation I'm going to have about your behavior. And if you say things or start speaking with a French accent, I would be very confused. You meaning Andreas. Mariam does have a French accent. Maybe an Australian accent for either of you. But yeah, and I guess it's more when I engage with another human, the uncertainties are based on the possible behaviors of a human. And I'm not anticipating that they will fly, but I am anticipating that they will behave in some way. And what is more uncertain is when I mix the human in the context. Like if I see human walking with a trench coat in the forest at night, the context has suddenly changed the types of behaviors I might expect. And I might anticipate a reaction just in case there is one. As opposed to if I walk past somebody in this building, I have zero anticipation of violence, right? And so I guess it's not that there is a prediction towards an endpoint, but there is an anticipation based on the available stimuli and based on the available information that I'm bringing in. I don't know if that's satisfactory, but that would be the rebuttal at least.
I actually don't. I come up with these some minor things that I can question, but I'm not sure if there's any purpose to it. The only thing I would say is that things like I expect a person not to fly, these kinds of things are suspicious to me because I just... this sounds like I have a number of explicit predictions about what's impossible, but I think I think you made a good point, and it's definitely an important mechanism of cognition.
I think we do have a lot of implicit predictions about what is impossible from a very young age. You know, like naive physics. I mean, some of it is, I think, being kind of reevaluated right now. I haven't read the latest paper on it, but you know, like how babies react differently to possible versus impossible physical events, and on this basis, how we consider that they do have predictions about how the physical world works very, very early on, if not at birth.
No, I totally agree with that. That's why I said it was sort of a stupid nitpick. If suddenly I shrink even more and I'm that big in the chair, I wouldn't say you are surprised because you predicted that I wouldn't shrink.
Yeah.
Right? You don't have a list
Yeah.
of infinite things you wouldn't predict. That's actually a stupid thing to bring up. So
No, but it's true. I mean, it asks the question of the format of these predictions, and like in which direction do they go? Are they negative predictions, as in I don't expect this to happen, this shouldn't happen, or are they more positive predictions, and this is the way that they are going to behave now because of this specific context that we're in, and given past experience in this context.
Yeah.
I think this is also how we can tie it into what we were discussing before about memory, is that we don't need to, in the same way that we don't need to think about all the things that won't happen, we also don't need to recall everything that has happened. We need to only anticipate what we expect, and we also only need to, I think for the same reason, recall the things that are most important for us, and allow us to then construct something more useful out of. So I think we pull the information that's necessary, both from a memory when we're witnessing an event, and also call up the information that's necessary when we're navigating a space. And I think that's how, because I guess to me, the main mysteries, of course, is how the brain is so efficient, how it can work on the same wattage that you can find in a potato, but do the same thing that a supercomputer can do. And I guess for me, a lot of the thing is that there's a high degree of compression of information, and that the storage of information is super sparse, but that by combining it, you can get really abstract behavior, complex behavior from a human. And I guess that's how I link these two things of the anticipation, but then also what's extracted from an event as we experience it.
Yeah, no, right. It's like you have the important landmarks, and then to mix metaphors, you can connect the dots between them, and yeah, you just need the rough indicators, and then you can reconstruct the experiences. But yeah, I shouldn't actually have added that. I think you summarized that more eloquently. So
no, I think you added a good point. Maybe we can sort of start wrapping up. One thing we always ask people is what the ultimate goal is of the research. Maybe not a short-term goal, but what they're most curious about and what's driving the research themselves. So is there? Yeah, that's sufficient.
I'm not even sure if I want to admit that, but my main interest, now that I've been thinking about memory a few years and working on it, to me, memory specifically doesn't seem that interesting to me anymore. And I'm more interested in just how connected representations are formed. And I realize this sounds extremely vague because it objectively is. But I guess one's experience can go in two different directions at least. So you either dive into ever more specific questions, or the boundaries between areas start blurring. And to me, it's the latter. So I'm starting to think about, what are the different kind of memory systems? Are they really that different? Are these processes really that different? I realize this is not a very constructive way of doing science and thinking about it, but I'm ultimately interested in sort of what are the units of cognition? What are the units of representation? Is there such a thing as a unit? Or is it like an inhomogeneous mess that it's just like different things are different in terms of representation? So it's just inherently different to read a novel and watch a sports game. It's just you don't have to find much of a common representational format, or do you find like this universal language of thought like thing, or whatever your favorite variety it may be. Of course, it's not something, I should point that out, it's not something I want to solve. It's just what interests me most as a question or gigantic set of questions in a distance. And it's something intriguing about the cognitive science, but it's also something gives you some pause that you can sanely state this kind of thing, that this isn't clear, or at least to me, maybe I'm lacking a fundamental piece here. We don't have like this general theory that we're fine-tuning, but rather the most central questions are uncertain, which I think is cool, but yeah.
I love that answer. Yeah.
Me too.
Is there anything else you want to add? Cool. I think we can end on that. That was great. Thank you so much, Andreas.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.